All right, Josh, let's get into Alabama preview. We talked about Ohio State today, and they're replacing quarterback that put up huge numbers last year and got some question marks on the offensive side of the ball. This year, everybody's coming to Alabama with hilariously, they are missing this player, this player, this player, and they're having to replace all these players and coaches as if Alabama hasn't had to do that almost every year throughout Nick Saban's tenure. I put out a stat on Twitter that mentioned four of Alabama's six. The stat was wrong. I said five, but I think it's four of six Alabama national championships have come under Nick Saban with a first-year starting quarterback. Now, there haven't been a lot of years where they're replacing starting quarterback, offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator. I think there's two things that we need to think about here. One is a given. Alabama reloads. A lot of these teams, Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, getting to be Michigan, they reload. They don't rebuild ever. So there's that piece of it that I think is a given. The other piece, though, where I think there are some question marks if you're not really close to this Alabama program, there's question marks around how can you replace your quarterback, your offensive coordinator, and your defensive coordinator and be remotely good or remotely ready for an SEC schedule. Josh, maybe this is a little bit more for the non-Alabama fans, and maybe the Alabama fans want to hear it. My contention is, and maybe you agree, the coordinators both are addition by subtraction. Not necessarily bad coordinators, but bad fits for the college game and for what they want to do at Alabama.
Well, it really parallels a lot of what we just talked about with Ohio State, right? That Knowles, as a coordinator, has really done a lot to improve the defensive side of the football. I don't think there's many Alabama fans that have been happy with their coordinators the last 2 years. And it's funny because in a lot of statistical metrics, Alabama's been really good, right? If you talk about who's the leader in the SEC last year in yard per play defense, it's Alabama by a substantial margin over Georgia. The best pass defense in the SEC was Alabama. I think they were like third in the country. Georgia was 23rd. Yard per attempt defense. So there were a lot of statistical categories defensively where they were really good, but I don't think they were viewed as being very good. And I think the reason is when push came to shove, they tended to get shoved. And Georgia was a better scoring defense by a significant margin than Alabama. I think around 14 versus 18 points per game. So I think when you look at everything from Alabama as an outsider's perspective, you know things have fallen off. But it's all a little weird because in a lot of statistics, metrics, and those metrics, again, are just straight up how much yards are they given, how tough is the defense. They've held their own, but the production hasn't come, and I think the consistency hasn't come. And last year in particular, it was a weird situation where Alabama's offense and defense couldn't be good at the same time, and they wouldn't both ever be bad at the same time. LSU game, they started the game with 4 straight 3-and-outs, I believe, and the defense just so happened that completely held, and I think they gave up 1 score from LSU in that period. Then the offense started to turn around, and then LSU started to score. And the same kind of thing happened in the Texas game. Same kind of thing happened somewhat in reverse in the Tennessee game. It just, they haven't had the consistency needed to dominate anyone. And last year, I think they had more 1-score, 2-score games in a year than they'd had in like 5 years previously, because both sides of the ball just weren't getting it done. And I'll say on the offensive side of the ball, we were always pretty critical of O'Brien. They started last year with a lot of 2 tight end stuff, even though their tight end was hurt, which really baffled me. It didn't work. They tried to be pro style. I don't think it worked. They tried to have complicated play calls where Bryce Young was adjusting the line of scrimmage. Well, it meant they were always snapping the ball late in road environments where it's difficult to get the snap off. I think it was at times devastating to them. And I think they've always put too much on Bryce Young. And rather than accepting that, yeah, there's some really easy plays anybody can make that can score a lot of points, they just said, well, we got a great quarterback, so let's make him be Tom Brady in a college world where you don't have to be Tom Brady. And on top of all that, there's areas we've been more critical than a lot of Alabama fans have liked. We've talked about the fact that I think Bryce Young's height was a limitation. I think Nick Saban's even hinted at that. They talked about they tried to focus on things he did well, which is why they didn't do the RPO. I think he has trouble throwing over the line of scrimmage and those slant RPO patterns. He just has a hard time getting the ball and quickly getting it out over a lineman's head to a receiver, and it kind of took a big part of the playbook out that they'd like to run. There may be some issues where even though the players are worse, the team might actually be better, and it's due to the coordinators, it's due to changes in personnel, maybe a better fit for what they're trying to do. So yeah, I definitely wouldn't jump to the conclusion that they're a worse team. And I'll give a thought and let you respond to it. It's always interesting to me when you talk about Alabama's championship years, right? You mentioned that four of the 6 titles came with a first-year quarterback. I think they've also come in years where they replaced a lot of what were perceived to be their biggest key players, right? 2011, maybe the most dominant Alabama team. They lose Marcel Darius, they lose Julio Jones. It was kind of this big-time exodus of their star players, their quarterback, their wide receiver, their defensive linemen, that were what made them, right? You know, Mark Ingram, Heisman Trophy winner's gone. And they turned around and were a much more dominant team in 11 than they were 10 because the core of the team got older and they fixed a lot of holes. You can make the argument, same thing, I think, from 2008 to 2009, lost their starting quarterback, lose a lot of their best defensive players. You can make the argument, like 2014 to 2015, they lose Amari Cooper, lose their starting quarterback, go to the guy that wasn't good enough to start in 2014, lost a lot of big defensive players. We're a better football team. So this has happened a lot through history with Alabama. People point to recruiting, you know, the ability to reload, and I think that's part of it. But I think it also really just speaks to the fact that college football is more about the core of your team than the players you know in a lot of cases. And we often focus on teams that replace the quarterback or they replace the star running back, and we miss the fact of like, yeah, but their offensive line's going to get better, which I think is probably going to be the case for Alabama. The defensive line's going to get better. Probably be the case compared to where they were at the end of last year. We can talk about all these issues. So, you know, with these high-level talent teams, I think these things are a lot more complicated. And Alabama, people don't remember it due to hindsight, but they've often won their titles and exceeded expectations in years where they were expected to be kind of reloading and be in a bit of an off year.
Yeah, and look, I think that we've talked about this a lot from a personnel standpoint, in that, you know, if you had a lot of guys drafted high and you didn't perform well on the field, you can point to coaching staffs. And when there's turnover there, it might be reason for optimism. I think that this Alabama team last year, and to some extent 21, other than getting hot late, this 2022 Alabama team is reflective of a coaching staff that did not have the DNA of previous staffs at Alabama. You know, the hallmark of Alabama through this run has been that they dominate teams that aren't elite. Like even top 25 teams. You're the 14th team in the country, come to Tuscaloosa, take your 30-point beating and go home. That's been Alabama. And it's you could see it in not just how they scheme and how they operate, but how the players play on the field. And you heard the locker room talk from Will Anderson and the being intimidated when they went to Neyland Stadium and things like that, or anxiety. I don't remember what the word was. To me, a lot of room for optimism for Alabama this year is looking at really how poorly they played in wins last year, because it wasn't Alabama. In spite of having all that talent, they were doing the same things over and over again. The checks at the line, the one D lineman, formations on defense. Alabama had close games that they had no business playing close games. Texas, when yours went down, they should have dominated that game. Alabama scored 20 points. In 7 of the next 9 games Texas played with that schedule, they still gave up at least 20 points. And I'm talking to like directional, non-P5 teams. Auburn, 10-horned Alabama on the ground. They had a quarterback who couldn't throw it in the ocean from a boat. Robbie Ashford was terrible in that game. 77 yards passing. They still put up 318 on the ground. These are not what you expect from an Alabama team, and you can't say it wasn't because they weren't talented enough. If they had all the talent in the world and they were underperforming in these wins, the Ole Miss game was close. The A&M game was close. These are games that showed both of us, one, they had no business in the playoffs. They didn't earn their right in the playoffs. You can't take the Kansas State data point and the championship game TC data point and then say, see, a month earlier you should have put Alabama in the playoffs. It doesn't work like that. The team that Alabama put on the field consistently throughout the season was not the team that belonged in the playoffs, and it's not the team we saw against Kansas State. And to your point, I think one of the biggest issues for Alabama, or the biggest issue for Alabama in the last couple of seasons, has been this thing where the defense and the offense can't be good at the same time. That's what's prevented them from having the type of games where they're consistently dominant against even good teams. The other thing that you noted is the 3 and outs. The 3 and outs are so damaging. They're like turnovers. Alabama had more 3 and outs in 2022 than they've had combined under Nick Saban. Combined. So I think that those two things reflect coaching, and that's where I want to get into a little bit more of coaching and the exact maybe scheme considerations that we're going to see in Tuscaloosa this year. Josh, even if Bill O'Brien technically is a better offensive coordinator, is it possible that without Bryce Young and with maybe definitely less experience, but maybe not even as good of an offensive coordinator, pure offensive coordinator in Tommy Rees, is it possible that we see a much better offense, at least from a scoring and efficiency standpoint, in Tuscaloosa this year?
Certainly, it's certainly possible, and there are various reasons to think that. One, I think if they just go to a more just RPO quarterback-friendly scheme, they could get more points just by default. There's no reason to go 3 and out 4 times in a row in modern college football. It's way too difficult to defend even a lot of base plays from a college offense if you have a high level of talent. And when you have a Heisman quarterback, it's really inexcusable, which says there's just something wrong with the scheme. And you point a lot to, I think O'Brien was almost a lot like Jimbo Fisher. He was trying to do things that in theory can work really well, but there's no reason you need to do it. And I think in a lot of ways it's easier for other teams to scheme and defend. One interesting factoid that we put on Twitter is Alabama only actually has 4 top 100 offensive skill players on their roster from their 2020 and 2021 classes. So that's you want to think of it like the junior, senior classes. There are only 4 top 100 skill players on the roster. There are 12 top 100 skill players in their freshman and sophomore classes. That's the guys that were freshmen last year and the guys they just signed. So there's a lot of young talent. In fact, I think a lot of people, when they evaluate Alabama and they look at, returning starters, I noticed just on the one I've got in front of me, like Kobe Prentice isn't listed as a returning starter, but I know for a fact from having watched him, he was essentially one of their starting receivers. At times probably, from what I saw, seemed to be their best receiver last year. I don't think many people understand how much of kind of a hole there was in a lot of their roster, and even though they had a Heisman QB, I think people knew the receiving core was down, but I don't think they realized that it was kind of a weird deal where last year where there were a lot of freshmen that were coming in, Bond and Prentice and all these guys that were young guys were starting to look like their best receivers, and they were their best receivers even in the bowl game. So if they take a scheme that just lets those guys play and lets them, use their own skill, they had a prolific offense with Blake Sims in 2014, and Blake Sims couldn't make a Canadian football roster. Great player. He did great things for them as a football team. Wasn't a high-level QB talent. And he was really a lot more effective than they had probably in a lot of ways with A.J. McCarron in 2013, who had a much more inconsistent offense. What happened? Changed offensive coordinator, did a better job of leveraging the skill position talent around the quarterback. So there's precedence for those changes. And, I wasn't quite sure where I'd fit this in, so I'll go ahead and note it. And you talk like top level draft picks, right? And overall turnover. They lost a lot of high level guys because they lost 3 guys in the first round. They had 4 guys drafted in the first 2 rounds. That's, a relatively low number for Alabama. It's about as few as they've had. In fact, if you want to look for fewer guys drafted in the first round, I'm looking back 2015 is the year, I think. So since the end of the 2014 season, that was as few first 2 round guys as they've had in a long time. They lost a lot of quality guys. A lot of guys had a lot of time in the program, particularly in the defensive side of the ball. We haven't even talked about it. A lot of guys 4th, 5th, 6th rounds, but they weren't the first rounders they were used to, weren't the second rounders. They were replaceable guys, and in a new scheme that does a better job of using high-level talent, there's a lot of reason to think they could be successful.
So we haven't talked much about the defensive side of the ball. And I think that the big highlight is you lose Will Anderson, so you're definitely going to have a drop off. I don't necessarily know that that's correct either, because I think that he was used he wasn't used to his full advantage in the scheme that he played in last year. I think that people are going to be surprised at how much quality, probably depth they have on the defensive line. The secondary is going to be ridiculous, in my opinion. But the question, Josh, is does Alabama have the pieces to improve? Their biggest challenge offensively was 3 and outs, but their biggest challenge defensively was getting off the field. And maybe that's somewhat due to the fact that they were tired because the offense kept giving the ball back to the other offense. But also in general, maybe schematically, there were some problems there. In your opinion, do you think that we'll see a return for this Alabama team to a team that can get off the field on third down? Or is this something that with modern offenses that it's never going to be great?
I do think it's something that's never going to be great, but what was striking is that Alabama couldn't get off the field on third down against inferior teams. I was the one that put together the video of the 1D lineman on the field against LSU. That was our soapbox and something we flagged. I'll note they did that even later in the year. The Auburn game, there's a play where Robbie Ashford runs a quarterback draw from like the 14-yard line, or just carries it. It's hard to tell. There was a draw and a carry at different points, and they had one defensive lineman on the field, and they scored on a 3rd and goal from the 14. So they did that kind of stuff a lot. And I know there was a conversion, which was a similar situation, 3rd and long, 1D lineman on the field. And in those cases, they had 3 outside linebackers. Our big complaint in the LSU game is they pulled a defensive lineman for a DB, but they kept 2 inside linebackers, so they blitzed 5 guys, 1 D lineman on the nose. They had 2 outside linebackers on each guard, and they had 2 inside linebackers on the tackle, which meant all across the formation, everybody was outmanned. And so the LSU got a lot of push, and Jaden Daniels had that big run in the 4th quarter that set him up, put him in a position to be able to tie in the game. If Alabama just doesn't do stupid stuff, I think they have a potential to be better. And even then, I want to be fair to the coordinators. I think there were some personnel issues. So after we put that video out, and I don't know if Alabama staff watched us, or I'm sure it really was just them self-evaluating those problems, they went with a lot more 3-man fronts. The Ole Miss game was the first one where I noticed it, where they'd have 3 defensive linemen on the field and 1 outside linebacker. And they really struggled against the run against Ole Miss. They tried it against Auburn and had the same issues. And the reason was that their inside linebacker play wasn't great. And I think Tuotoa was not the guy any of us expected to be. We expected a 1st, 2nd round guy, and we got a 5th round guy. Again, there were a lot of projections for Alabama last year that I think we still haven't quite acknowledged. They didn't quite pan out. They were borderline mid-tier, borderline NFL players. They were not NFL stars like we expected. But the off linebacker, who was Moody or Lawson, never knew how to set the edge for them. And I think they were so built around using so many outside linebackers with Anderson and Turner, and then they have Braswell as the 3rd guy who's going to step in as a starter this year, that when they went back to a more normal scheme, they were super uncomfortable. And I would watch teams run sweeps. Ole Miss and Auburn both would run sweeps to the strong side of the formation, would run opposite Will Anderson as much as they could, and the linebackers could never get out in front of it. They were always getting pinned inside, and the running back would come out. And that's just fundamental football. It's about not knowing how to run a base defense. They're going to fix that. And I think when they fix those issues, they're going to be a better team. I think they've got enough young talent to be better. Moody, who left them, he was a senior player, wasn't a great player. He didn't have a lot of high-level athleticism. Lawson, who's going to start this year, when he played, he thought he was better, but he was clearly playing injured. He missed all spring with an injury. I think they're going to be a more sound team. I think they're going to have last year I think they had a couple players at safety, at linebacker, there were weaknesses and holes. And because of how strained their scheme was, we talked about this with Tennessee. Tennessee could put a guy in motion in a split formation, and they knew they were going to, 1, they could draw an outside linebacker into coverage, and 2, they knew they could get a one-on-one with a safety. I don't think Alabama's going to be as predictable. I think they're going to do a better job of keeping corners on top of receivers, not exposing safeties. I think they're going to be more sound in the back 7. It's a funny thing to me when you look at LSU and Alabama. LSU's this trendy pick, LSU has a lot of turnover on the defensive side of the ball. They've brought in a lot of transfers to shore up the secondary. Alabama not only have a lot of talent, but they've brought in some really high level transfers. And it's weird to me that they get no credit for that, right? That clearly are trying to fill up deficiencies and make sure they're sound on the back end. And we kind of feel like Alabama's going to be shaky, and we just assume LSU is going to plug and play, even though we know Alabama's returning guys are pretty good. So it seems to me like Alabama's almost certainly going to be solid, and LSU is the one that should be the bigger question. I still haven't figured that out yet from a national perspective, but I do think there's every reason to think they're going to turn things around and be a more solid, especially on the defensive side of the ball, a more solid football team.
Funny that we're talking about a team turning things around that went 11-2 last year, but for Alabama standards, that's where we're at. I want to end this by talking about the schedule, because really going into last season, nobody, not us, not anybody in the national media, nobody really appreciated the challenge of the home road splits and how they lined up for Alabama last year. It was brutal. And you've got Auburn at home. That's the big game at the end of the year, but Auburn wasn't that good. You had to go on the road to Tennessee. You had to go on the road to LSU. This year, you had to go on the road to Texas, 137 degrees and 130,000 people. This year, it's much more favorable for Alabama from that respect. So you got Texas in Tuscaloosa. You've got Arkansas, who I think is going to be a good team. They have a brutal schedule on their own, and it won't show up in the win-loss column. That's going to be a very good team this year. Tennessee's at home. LSU's at home, and those are all in a row. At Kentucky, at Auburn. There's the one game at Texas A&M that I think might be a challenge for Alabama. I'm on the record as saying I think Texas A&M is going to be much improved this year. We're doing this thing where we're doing the over-under for the teams. I'm setting the over-under at 10.5. Josh, I'll go first. I think it's over. I do think they lose a game. And I don't think the loss comes Tennessee or LSU. Here's where I think it happens. This is the stretch after Texas and then in South Florida. They've got Ole Miss and then at Miss State, at A&M versus Arkansas all in a row. That's a tough stretch. It's not, there's not an elite team in there, but that's 4 quality teams. They get a bye week before Tennessee, or it will be super brutal because then it's Tennessee and LSU. I think somewhere in that stretch, Alabama drops a game, because I don't think there's going to be a monster this year like a 2020 Alabama, 2019 LSU. I do think they win the West. I think they go 11-1. I think they drop a weird game in that rough stretch. Give me your over or under 10.5 games for Alabama.
I lean over. I think that probably is the right number. I know it's Vegas's number. I was just checking it. It really depends a lot on the quarterback situation and how quickly that develops. So last year, they started with Texas in week 2. They really struggled in that game. Now, Texas ended up leading the country in quarterback pressures, I believe, last season, which I think a lot of Alabama fans let that fly under the radar. That's been their problem. The last few years, the offensive line hasn't always held up. And I feel like Bryce Young as a player has some particular weaknesses if there's a really crowded line of scrimmage. And so it all kind of compounded. Texas has a lot of turnover, so I don't necessarily see that being the same challenge at home for Alabama this season. It was a team that's very much led by their best players, I think, and when guys got banged up, they weren't always nearly as good of a football team. So I'll kind of believe it when I see it there. But through the rest of the schedule, like you said, that September through October gauntlet's really hard, and it's probably going to determine the answer to this question. And really, for them to make it through that gauntlet, they're going to have solid quarterback play, right? And that's the thing we haven't touched on at length. I do think Milroe last year in the Texas A&M game, look, that was his first start against what was a very good defense, one of the, I think, if not the top, probably the best pass defense in the SEC, one of the best in the country. Weren't a very good run defense, and everybody looks at the quarterback situation in that game, and I've always said, well, the problem for Alabama is they didn't run the ball. Appalachian State beat them because they ran all over them. Alabama's got to be better on the offensive line. I think they will be, but they've got to get a quarterback to complement it. And if they can get the quarterback play
But Josh,
together,
do they need elite quarterback play? Because you said good quarterback play. Do they need elite quarterback?
I don't think it has to be elite. It just has to be good. They if they drop a game, it's almost certainly, in my opinion, going to be a situation where the quarterback is a disaster. If you think back to, you can check my math on this, but I believe the 2009 Alabama game where Terrence Cody blocked the field goal to win the game. The thing people forget about that game, it was Greg McElroy's first year starting, and I want to say it had a total implosion. I think they threw like 4 interceptions in that game. A lot of cases where Alabama's dropped games, it's because the quarterback play has been awful. When they lost to Ole Miss in 2014, that was a game where Blake Sims showed that he was a below average quarterback. I think they worked miracle with him because from a quarterback perspective, he really wasn't a solid passer. They need solid to get through that conflict. They don't need elite. If they get good, they can win those by a significant margin, I think. But they need, at minimum, solid. And evaluating that's tough. I will say the spring game did not look good, but a lot like Ohio State, the story to me in the spring is the left tackle for the first team offense, when I went back and watched it, was just getting mauled. So Milroe, who was a starting quarterback, had a terrible day. Same way McCord at Ohio State. They have 2 new offensive tackles. They weren't gelled. Their offensive line got mauled the whole spring, and their passing statistics weren't great. But at the same time, I went back and looked at prior spring games for Alabama. You look at like 2018, Jalen Hurts was 19 of 37 for 195 yards. You look at 2019, before they really exploded as a passing offense, mediocre spring game. 2017, mediocre spring game. It's been a trend for Alabama for years that they don't put the offense in a position to succeed. So I think it's just a question. If they get solid QB play, if the offensive line is improved, which I think it will be, they've got the talent on the roster finally to turn that around. The interior offensive line, people talk about the tackles, the interior offensive line has got no push for them for years. They're going to be a solid core. And they've got to have good, but they've got to be good enough at quarterback where week 4 to week 8, which is when quarterbacks are figuring things out, that they don't have an absolute dud against a team that's playing a good football game. And if they can do that, they'll put them in a position to make it to the end of the year with one more loss and possibly win the division, have a chance to beat Georgia, et cetera, et cetera. If they don't turn that around fast enough, then they may drop a game early. And if they drop a game early, the end of the year is such a, I think, like you said, if you look at just the second half, at A&M, Arkansas, Tennessee, LSU, at Auburn, it's hard to make it through that without one loss. So if you lose one early, you're probably going to drop a second late.
Greg McElroy, who follows us on Twitter, is going to get you for that 2009 Tennessee-Alabama game where he had no interceptions. He only had 120 yards passing, but he had no interceptions. Okay. The 4 interception game was the 2015 Ole Miss game, the crazy tip interception or catch. I think there were a lot of 4 turnovers in that game.
Well, I will interject and say I think McElroy is probably gracious enough to acknowledge that he maybe didn't have the best game, even if I had the stats wrong. But it was 4.1 yards per attempt, so that's my 4 number came from in my head. But the point to me with Sims and McElroy both, they weren't bad quarterbacks for Alabama. But in that week 4 to week 6 gauntlet with a first-year starter, the quarterbacks that haven't been high-level NFL talents have often had a game where they were just really struggled when they first hit the meat of the conference schedule. Sometimes, like I think Sims lit up Florida before he turned around and had a dud against Ole Miss. So that's really what I'm flagging. The quarterbacks need to be solid enough that they don't have an absolute dud, because then they're going to drop a game in that gauntlet. And if they're solid enough, if they find one guy that can play at a decent enough level, he's probably going to have a rough game, but it won't be so rough that it'll cost them the win, and they'll find a way to pull it out like Alabama did in 2009.
But no, I'm totally with you. I don't think they need elite quarterback, but they need good, consistent quarterback play. They need to avoid 3-and-out city. That's a wrap for us on this 2023 season Alabama preview. Got a lot more coming this preseason. Obviously, this is a cut up if you're watching just the cut up for the Alabama preview, but we do a full episode where we talk just talk ball. We do previews. We talk about other topics around college football. So keep an eye out. You can go to our YouTube page and see it there, or just listen to the full podcast version. Check out the website, collegefootballnerds.com. Sign up for the newsletter. We got some more stuff in store that's stats related that you're going to want to get into throughout the regular season. We haven't released it yet. We haven't announced it yet, but it's coming. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.